Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the life and work of Paul Feyerabend. Now you're coming at this from a more philosophical angle,
That's
right? So
right.
you're looking for that kind of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you haven't heard of Feyerabend specifically before, I think you're going to find his ideas pretty interesting,
Yeah.
especially from that philosophical background.
Yeah. I think he offers a lot of really good challenges to how we think about science and how we think about knowledge and even reality itself.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to be talking about, can there be one scientific method?
Right.
Is science truly objective? And how do all these things kind of play into somebody trying to understand the world in a more philosophical way?
Yeah, it's not so much about saying that science is bad or that
Yeah.
science is wrong, but it's more about just sort of recognizing that it's more complicated than we maybe give it credit for.
Yeah, let's start by getting to know Feyerabend the person a little bit. I mean, he wasn't a typical philosopher.
No, not at all.
Like, how did he even get into philosophy?
Well, his path to philosophy was pretty unusual. He started out with a pretty deep interest in physics and astronomy.
Okay.
In fact, as a teenager, he even built his own telescope.
Wow, that's awesome. I also read that he loved to sing and even considered a career in opera. It seems like a pretty strange mix.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a strange mix, but it kind of speaks to his, I think, just intellectual curiosity and his willingness to look at the world in many different ways.
Right.
And I think this diverse background really shows up in his later philosophical work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to better understand his ideas, let's maybe walk through some of the major moments in his life that may have shaped his thinking, kind of see the evolution of his ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a good place to start would be with his experiences during World War II.
Okay.
So Feyerabend served in the German army, and he actually received the Iron Cross for his service. But later in life, he described the war as more of an inconvenience
Wow.
than like a moral dilemma.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. It is a very interesting take on it. And, I wonder if those kinds of experiences shaped his skepticism towards authority and received wisdom that we see later on.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, having to go through something like that would definitely, I think, change your outlook on a lot of things.
Yeah. So let's jump ahead a little bit to when he encounters the Vienna Circle.
Okay.
Now, this was a group of philosophers who believed that science was like the ultimate source of knowledge.
Okay.
Right? And initially, Feyerabend was really drawn to this idea.
Okay.
He called himself a raving positivist early on, believing that knowledge really stemmed from scientific observation and logical analysis.
Okay, so he was like all in on this idea.
Totally.
What happened?
Well, what happened was he got involved with this other group called the Kraft Circle,
Okay.
led by his dissertation supervisor, Victor Kraft. And this group really grappled with some fundamental questions about the nature of reality itself.
Okay.
They debated the existence of the external world even, some really heavy philosophical questions.
Yeah. And then after all of that, he meets Karl Popper.
Yes, and this meeting was really pivotal for him. Popper's idea of falsificationism, this idea that scientific theories can only be disproven but never definitively proven.
Right.
This really captured Feyerabend's imagination. He saw it as a more dynamic and nuanced approach to science.
So a little more flexible than what the Vienna Circle was proposing.
Yeah, exactly.
I read that they became good friends.
They did.
But then Feyerabend eventually kind of breaks away from that strict Popperian thought.
Yeah, he did.
Why is that?
Well, he starts to find it too limiting.
Okay.
He was always pushing the boundaries, always questioning even the thinkers that he really admired.
And that led him to Wittgenstein.
Yeah, exactly.
Wittgenstein's known for his ideas about language games and how they shape our understanding of the world.
Right.
So it seems like a pretty natural progression for Feyerabend, given that he was interested in challenging, already existing thought.
Yeah, absolutely. He really dove into Wittgenstein's ideas, especially this idea that meaning comes from the way we use language in specific contexts, these language games.
Okay.
And this really fit with his own evolving views about, how we construct understanding and how we know what we know.
So we've got this kind of mix of things that are influencing him.
Yeah.
His experiences in the war, positivism, falsificationism, language games.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the perfect recipe for like a totally unique and kind of challenging philosophical perspective.
Yeah, it is.
So how do all these things kind of come together in his later work?
Well, that's where his really groundbreaking book, Against Method, comes in, and that's what we'll talk about next.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to discuss that.
So in Against Method, Feyerabend really lays out his critique of the traditional ways that we think about science.
This is where he kind of introduces this anything goes idea, right?
Yeah,
That
exactly.
there isn't one set method for scientific progress.
Right.
But I feel like that phrase gets thrown around a lot and sometimes maybe out of context.
Yeah.
So what does he really mean by anything goes?
Yeah, he's not saying that all methods are equal or that, being rigorous in your research doesn't matter at all.
Right.
What he's really getting at is this idea that there isn't one single correct scientific method that you can apply to every situation to get good results.
Okay.
He argues that, throughout history, a lot of scientific progress has actually been made when people broke free from the accepted methods of their time.
And this is where he brings in Galileo, right?
Exactly.
As like the main example for this.
Yeah, he looks at how Galileo, who's, a huge proponent of heliocentrism, didn't always follow the strict scientific standards of his time.
Right?
He actually used rhetoric and persuasion and even what some people might consider tricks
Okay.
to promote his ideas.
So it's more nuanced than just like, oh, I have this new scientific theory.
Right.
There are other forces at play.
Exact. So it's not always this, purely objective, method-driven process like we're sometimes led to believe.
Right.
It's much more interesting than that.
So it's not always linear.
No, not at all.
There's no set path to get to these big ideas.
Right. And sometimes you even have to, kind of work the system a little bit
Right.
to get people to listen to you.
Yeah. It makes me think of like Kuhn and how paradigms shift.
Mm-hmm.
It's rarely this like neat and tidy process.
Right.
Usually someone has to come in and like shake things up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Challenge the accepted wisdom.
And Feyerabend was all about shaking things up.
Yeah. And that kind of leads us into his later work where he starts to get even more skeptical of the authority of science.
Yeah.
He even calls for the separation of science and the state.
Yeah, he did. He was worried about science becoming too dogmatic and potentially oppressive.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, he saw how science could be used to justify all sorts of things, even things that were harmful or unjust.
Okay.
And he thought that if science and the state were too closely linked, then science could lose its objectivity
Right.
and become a tool of the powerful.
Yeah, it's like if science becomes the ultimate authority, then how do you question that authority?
Exactly.
Especially if it's tied up with the government.
Exactly. And this kind of leads into his flirtation with relativism, where he suggests that there may not be an objective way to choose between different belief systems.
Oh, so not just science.
Not just science.
Any belief system.
Yeah, he's really pushing us to think critically about our own assumptions, about what's true and what's objective.
Okay.
Even when it comes to science.
So is he saying that all beliefs are equally valid?
Well, not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
He's not saying that we should just accept everything we hear,
Right.
but he is saying that we should be aware of the fact that our own perspectives are always shaped by our own beliefs and our own experiences.
Okay.
And so we can't really claim to be completely objective.
So we've always got these biases
Yeah,
that we bring with us.
yeah, and this leads into another important idea from Feyerabend, this idea of the disunity of science.
Okay.
He argues that science isn't this monolithic thing with like one unified method.
Okay.
It's actually a collection of lots of different approaches and methods and perspectives.
So more like an ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly.
All of these different things interacting.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Feyerabend wasn't anti-science.
Right.
He just had a more complex and somewhat, say, more radical view of how science works and how we create knowledge.
So what does all this mean for us?
Yeah.
For somebody coming at this from like a philosophical perspective,
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
how do we even begin to grapple with all these like challenging ideas?
Well, I think that's what we need to explore now.
Awesome. Let's take a quick break and then we'll dive into that.
So we've kind of taken this journey through Feyerabend's life, all these different influences and these critiques of how science is traditionally done.
Right. And I think for someone coming at this from more of a philosophical background, what are the big takeaways here?
I think Feyerabend is really pushing us to re-examine some of the assumptions that we have about how knowledge works,
Okay.
especially scientific knowledge.
And one of the biggest things I think is this idea that science is purely objective,
Yeah,
that there's no values involved. It's just this pursuit of the truth.
right. And I think Feyerabend would say that that's just not realistic. There's always going to be some level of subjectivity.
Right. Because it's people doing the science,
Exactly.
people with biases.
Yeah, and he's not saying that's necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
He's just saying that we need to be aware of it
Right.
and we need to take it into account.
Okay. So what does that look like?
Well, for one thing, I think it means being open to different perspectives.
Okay.
Even perspectives that we might disagree with.
So not just shutting down ideas because they don't fit the current paradigm.
Exactly. And this is where this idea of theoretical pluralism comes in,
Okay.
which is basically the idea that having a diversity of perspectives can actually lead to better science.
Okay, so it's more about encouraging those fringe areas, those alternative ideas.
Yeah, and not being afraid to challenge the status quo.
Okay, and I think that ties in nicely with his idea of separating science from the state.
Right, because if science is too closely tied to power,
Right,
then it can be used to silence dissenting voices.
right, which would kind of stifle all that creativity and those new ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
And as philosophers, I think we really value that free exchange of ideas.
Absolutely. And I think Feyerabend's work is really helpful for us because it encourages us to think critically about how knowledge is produced
Hmm.
and who gets to decide what counts as valid knowledge.
It's a reminder that science is a human endeavor.
Right.
It's not this perfect thing,
And like all human endeavors, it can be misused.
so we need to be cautious.
Yeah, we need to be mindful of the potential for science to be used in harmful ways.
So as we kind of wrap things up here,
Yeah.
what would you say is like the most important thing that our listeners should take away from Feyerabend's work?
Well, I think Feyerabend's biggest contribution is his unwavering commitment to challenging our assumptions.
Okay.
He's always pushing us to think outside the box,
Right.
to consider different
Yeah.
perspectives, and to be skeptical of any claims to absolute truth.
So question everything.
Question everything.
Keep learning.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive into the world of Paul Feyerabend.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, I hope our listeners enjoyed it and that they learned something new.
Me too.
And as always, keep thinking, keep exploring, and most importantly, never stop asking questions.
Yep.